Everyone, my name is Jesse with Core Concept and welcome back to the Rollout Developer Tools tutorial series. In today's video we are going to be looking at buildings and subsprites. So let's dive right in. Now buildings are actually items, so this is just going to be looking at some of the additional properties of items themselves. Well, what we're going to do is we are going to create a building AI control station or something like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to say AI control station. And what we'll have this building do is there's a hostile enemy that we're going to add later, which is an AI drone. What we're going to do is if the player builds this AI control station, it's going to turn all of those drones not hostile. So it's going to be a really powerful building, kind of a must, but what I would probably do is make this a little bit later in the research tree or even driven by an event or something like that. But causes all AI drones to not be hostile. I'll reword that better off camera, but that's good enough. The next field that we're going to be looking at is the UI sprite. It can be pretty much whatever you want. We're just going to use the building sprite itself and the world sprite. Now we're going to, what you want to do when you're creating a building is buildings and decorations specifically have a shadow that moves based on time of day. So what you want to do is if you're doing a perspective like this, you're going to want your pivot point to be this bottom corner of the building. So let's see, and really that's what these attributes are great for. So we're just going to use those values there. That should be just fine. This sprite is not animated. Scale is 1. Storage per unit doesn't matter. We're not actually putting this in our inventory. Minimap color. Typically buildings are yellow. So if you want to follow that standard, it is just the third from the right here on standard colors. Lua script file. This building is actually not going to have the Lua script file. The drones themselves are going to check for it. It's actually significantly easier, and it covers us in case an event or something else spawns more of them. Research requirements. We haven't actually created the research that's going to limit this yet, so that would be something you come back to. But cybernetic speed, for example, you would just start typing it in, it auto-completes, and that's your requirement. You can have as many of them as you like. We're not going to bother with that yet. That'll be something that you would come back to fix. Initial quantity 0. Obviously, you're not going to have any. Subsprites. Let's say you want to put a little radar dish on the top, but it's only there under a condition, or you want to animate it, or for whatever reason you want to change the render order of it. There are going to be a whole bunch of reasons, but you would want to add a subsprite. So we're going to add a dish onto the top of it. Again, you're going to want to kind of set this thing's pivot point to be that bottom section of it. Subsprites don't cast shadow, but it's still, you're gonna want this point to be accurate later. So you just kind of play around with it a little bit. That's good, and maybe we'll back that to here. That should be fine. Now this point that you've specified is going to be placed at offset to this sprite. So right now this point is going to go right here. So a useful trick is to actually use either the UI sprite or the world sprite pivot point to place where your subsprite is going to go. So 0.5, that's actually pretty good. Maybe we say 0.52. That's pretty good. So all you do, 0.52 rather, and 0.5. You can attach a Lua script to the subsprite. You can rotate it, you can scale it, etc., etc. Which is just some basic Lua transformation code. in this case, with the nature of this sprite, it's not really set up to rotate. If you wanted to make it rotatable, what you probably want to do is not have this base on it. You just have the dish itself, and then it could rotate. But that's what subsprites will do. Subsprites will always render in front of the building that they're on. They will not go behind it. There currently is no way to do that. You can have animated subsprites as well. So if you wanted to pre-draw the dish's animation, but maybe have it as a smaller sprite, not including the entire building, it makes animation easier. There's a whole bunch of reasons to use a subsprite. So now we have our and once you use that trick, don't forget to set your pivot point back. That's actually a good reason why you should use the UI sprite, because for a building, it's pretty much never in the UI, so that pivot point doesn't really matter as much. So the next thing we're going to be able to do, because this is a building, is we're going to make it buildable. So the build mask, if it is 1 for ground, 2 for water, 3 for both, this one, it just determines where the player can build them. Typically, it's going to be a build mask of 1. Build time, how long does it take to build it? Let's say it's going to take 2 minutes. It's relatively long, so the player is going to have to survive and defend long enough to build this building, but after 2 minutes, all of those drones are going to be not hostile. If you want to have the building emit light, which is useful for at night, things like that, you can specify that here. Let's do light intensity of, actually let's make it a pretty decent source of light. We'll do something like that. That's actually a pretty significant light. And what we're going to do is we'll do kind of a grayish color, though. So it's kind of a, well, let's do like a blue-gray light. Somewhere in there. Should be just fine. You can set the hit points of the building. Weather does damage to buildings. Should you so choose to write the AI for units that they target buildings, they can attack them. There's a few ways that buildings can be attacked. If their hit points reach 0, the building is destroyed. Inventory size. If a building has an inventory, which any building will, you can set how much inventory space it has. This is useful for if the building crafts given items, or if it's a drop-off point for resources, things like that. It's you can change how much inventory size, and that's in volume. So when you say storage per unit, if you had something that was 500 in storage to carry one of them, this building could hold 2 of those. So these are equivalent unit sizes. So that's a buildable. Oh, no, we're not done. You need your build materials. So let's say, what would a building like this be made out of? Let's say some wood, some stone, some metal, and some microchips. And we'll say, yeah, because you use stone for kind of like the walls and a foundation. So, I don't know, maybe you need like 30 of it. And wood for some framing, stuff like that. I like to try and ration why you would need what you do. Metal is going to be used for wiring, for maybe this antenna, stuff like that. So it's not going to need too much, so maybe 5. And then we'll say maybe 10 microchips to kind of represent the control surfaces of it. If you had like ceramic or whatever, you can specify whatever resources you want. This is where you specify what the building costs. So we have, it can only be built on ground. It takes 2 minutes. It emits a decently bright blue light. This is what it costs. It does not replace ground tiles. This is really only something you use if you're making a bridge. Basically, it's going to delete the ground underneath it and replace it with this building. And it's also going to cause the nav mesh to be updated around it. So you might do something like a wall or something like that. The only thing to note is it will delete the ground underneath it. So what you're going to want to do is make sure that this sprite fills in its entire square and the pixels per unit on the world sprite is at least 128. In fact, it should be exactly 128 in that scenario so that the terrain still looks good. So you're not going to use replace ground tiles all that often, but it is an option if you wanted to make, say, some kind of bridge or otherwise ground replacing tile. The other thing that I want to cover in this, because it's in the same realm, is Tileset items, and that's typically natural resources, decorations, stuff like that. Now, you can just create them under items themselves, and if you say world spawn, it enables them on all tile sets. The reason that there's items under given tile sets is it restricts that item to that one tile set. It's just a different way of going about these restrictions rather than tags. So if you create a new tile set item, one thing I created is, for example, a metal tree. And this lexicon entry is going to be also displayed when the player hovers over the item in the world. So tree made of metal. I have just a simple sprite here. Sprite scales 1, that's fine. Collider offset and size are actually going to go away soon. The game is capable of calculating that now. Minimap color, we'll just kind of set it to something that's similar to the sprite. And no research requirements, no upgrades, no subsprites. However, we're going to make it world spawn. Now this frequency here, the game uses Perlin noise to generate its decorations. So Perlin noise is going to be from 0 to 1. At any given point where it'll kind of spot check along the map. So if I, just as an example, if this is your map, the Perlin noise is going to be randomly generated, and then the game's going to kind of do a spot check along like this kind of thing in random places. And at that point, if your Perlin noise value is higher than this frequency, this item will generate. So what that translates to in a simple explanation is how rare is this item. The lower the number, the less chance it'll generate. And I recommend you do not set this any higher than 0.35, or you will very likely either crash the game or cause it to run out of objects to spawn, and it'll just fail. So what we're going to do is we're going to say the metal one is just 0.1. That should be... it should cause, let's say 0.15. It should cause it to be on every map, but not be everywhere. It'll kind of be in little clusters. You can set random rotation. It will rotate it horizontally. So if you have, say, rocks or something like that, just random decorations that don't do anything that you want to spawn in, random rotation can give them a little bit of variety. And research requirements mean that the item will not spawn unless the player has completed those research entries. Now at this point, this tree will spawn, but it won't do anything. So what we want to do is we want to make it gatherable. And you need to say what resource they can gather from it, and we'll say item metal, which is a base game. Quantity is the total of how much each tree has, and the gather rate is how fast something can gather from this tree with each trip. Now this gather rate is going to be multiplied by their gather modifier. So for example, if we do a gather rate of 1 rather, and a cyborg gathers, they're going to require 2 trips to gather this completely. 1 trip bringing 0.75 and a second trip bringing the remaining 0.25. The other thing that I neglected to do is set the pivot point to where it needs to be. So I'm just going to, again, kind of play around with this. that's pretty good. This is where the shadow is going to emit from. Again, not as important for the UI sprite, but I like everything to be set just in case I accidentally change the world sprite. I've got one that I can go back to. It's just good to have. Then you can say a 2/3 sprite and a 1/3 sprite. If you happen to have them, as more and more of the resources gathered, the 2/3 sprite will be switched out when less than 2/3 of the initial resource is remaining. So say we have 5 and it hits, well, that's terrible for simple math. Say we have 6 and it hits 4, it's going to show the 2/3 sprite instead of our main world sprite. And then at 2 in this scenario, it would show the 1/3 sprite before being removed entirely. Those are optional. Generally what I like to do is just set them as the same thing as the other, even if you don't have them, just for completeness sake, but it is not required. You can see we have a validation error. What did I miss? Cyborg normal crew sprite. Let's see, where was that? Let's keep normal. Let's save that. Okay, so that's going to cause our tree to exist in the game. It's going to spawn in the world, and it's going to be gatherable. So that's pretty much all we need from here. It's actually a very valuable resource. You can get metal from this tree pretty much for free, so it's going to be a pretty good one, but it will only spawn on the metal tile set because of where we created it. We've also created our AI control station, which we'll come back to when we create the actual AI drone. But that's going to do it for this tutorial. This one's long enough as it is. Up next, as far as our tutorials, we have the actors themselves. So in our next video, we are going to be adding our AI drones. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial.